So let's move on to this talk, which Andrew and I have been putting together, called Understanding European Imaginaries of Higher Education, the Vision for Bologna and Lisbon to Sorbonne again, and European Universities. And what we're doing is Andrew and I are presenting this talk, and there'll be a pause for discussions midway and for questions at the end. More questions of fact or understanding rather than a major discussion, but we don't want to keep talking if there's things that are unclear. And then we're very honoured to have Berit Eicher, our pro-rector from Aarhus University here, and she will act as a discussant. And I'm not sure, Berit, if you want to take over the floor at that point, or you want to Andrew and me to ask you questions, but we'll work that one out later. And then we've then got 25 minutes for a workshop session on the talk with some questions that Andrew and I have prepared, and then bringing that into a quick discussion at the end in a plenary form. So that's the program for the next hour and 3/4. So Andrew, let's move to the next slide.
And it's over to me, I think.
You think it is?
So where we were coming from with this was a question that myself and Sue started, that was posed to each other, was 20 years of European policy in higher education and the challenges that that entails. When you start addressing yourself to that amount of European policy over that period of time, it seems quite like quite a lot to get through. So we set ourselves a challenge of finding a way to structure it in such a way that it was more graspable. And what we started off with is basically the notion that policy is never just policy. You can conceptualize it in terms of, and this is where we're bringing in Manfred Steger in one of the readings, these notion of social imaginaries. So policy in all forms is creating some kind of a social imaginary. European policy is doing the same thing in higher education, creating these shared visions of self and community. When Steger is writing about this, he identifies the various sources of this from Charles Taylor, Benedict Anderson, imagined communities coming in there, Pierre Bourdieu. But Steger is coming from that notion of a social imaginary to build towards what he's calling these global imaginaries. So that is what we were using to address European higher education policy. And European higher education and research policy since Lisbon has had these global ambitions of creating a Europe of knowledge, which was made up of the European research area and the European higher education area. As Honig is discussing this, she was talking about the notion of there being in Europe a fragmented research landscape. And you could attach the same notion of fragmentation to the higher education landscape as well. So the goal of the ERA, the European Research Area, and the European Higher Education Area was to bring some coherence to this fragmentation. So if Europe was to becoming a leading world region in this concept of the competitive global knowledge economy, some kind of shape had to be put onto that, some kind of coherence. Elsewhere, that's been described as fabricating Europe through the formation of an education space. Just to return to that point again, that we're talking about an imaginary that is global. So that is Europe as a global construct working on a global scene. But as Steger would note, and various other people would talk about, it still has roots in the national. It's one imaginary among others. So the European imaginary, as it functions across Europe and within individual countries, it is working in the same context as various other imaginaries that exist. And we'll go into some examples to show what we mean by that. But different national settings have their own pre-existing competing imaginaries of the global. So the ERA and the European Higher Education Area, the EHEA, we're creating a global imaginary of Europe. in higher education. There were already other competing imaginaries. Such pre-existing imaginaries were used in some ways to transcend the limits of the national. So you can think of the Commonwealth coming out of the United Kingdom, La Francophonie, obviously coming out of France. And one of the functions of this was in some ways to overcome the limits of your own borders, overcoming the limitations of working just within that national context. But that can also be conceptualized from the European perspective as not just overcoming limits of the national, but as effectively bypassing the national. So the question that comes out of that for us is, who is using these global imaginaries, and to what end are they using them? What are the powers that they have in creating and deploying these global imaginaries?
So that then comes to me to look at what powers are available to create European imaginaries. And here's two slides, the first one on research. And they're quite different from each other. Research and education have different powers attached to them. On the research side, it starts right from the very beginning of the first ways in which Europe was put together after the Second World War, where the Schuman-Monet plan was to create one economic sector after another so that the countries would be interdependent and war would be unthinkable. And built into that, research was included in the transformation of coal and steel and nuclear energy right from the very start. And the Single European Act in 1987 gave the European Union treaty powers for doing research. And in the 1980s, there was a profusion of research activities that had been building up from the 1950s through, and they were consolidated into what was called the Framework Programme and was later called the Horizon Programme. But in addition to that, there were also all sorts of other funded activities, mainly about science linkages and linkages between science researchers and industry. And there's a whole range of acronyms that I won't go into, but you can see the ERICS and ESFRIs and European Space Agency. So the European Union's role in research was unquestioned. Ministers agreed a budget and a programme that was of research that was geared to economic development and involved collaboration between universities and between universities and industry, the development of infrastructure and innovation. And you can see just the Horizon or the FP Horizon funding has gone up enormously, but that isn't the whole of the funding on research. So there's a very strong remit for and budget for working on research. If we go to the next slide, education is quite different. First of all, there isn't a clear idea of what education is for. In research, it's very clear it's to develop these new industrial sectors. But in education, it's got a European dimension, which is the idea that education is to generate through peace, through mutual cultural understanding and European values. There's a social dimension, which is that a recognition that the development of the single market creates inequalities, and therefore to assist groups and spaces within Europe that are marginalized by market integration, to increase employability of marginalized people. And then there's also gender equality, diversity, active citizenship, ideas around cultural diversity and democracy. And the third one is not actually called the economic dimension. The European dimension and the social dimension are terms used in the policy documents. But the vocational training and skills is kind of the taken for granted aspect of the role of education that fits with the research agenda. But Europe doesn't have powers over education like it has over research. The idea is that education lies at the heartland of national sovereignty. So right from the start, it's been a taboo for the European Union to get involved in national activities around education. There's no remit, no clear remit for the EU to work on education. But in 1985, the Court of Justice of European Communities redefined vocational education to include higher education. And that opened the opportunity for Europe to begin spending and set up a program on higher education called the Erasmus program. And it was focused on the European dimension of education, which is to encourage student and staff mobility, actually, into university cooperation, and to back up the students moving and taking courses in other countries, in other universities. The system of what's called ECTS, the merit that is carried from one course in one country to another course in another country. The Maastricht Treaty in 1992 expanded the EU's competences, but education still was what's called a complementary competence. So it's in the same status as culture and health. It does not have primary, the EU doesn't have primary ability to work on that field. And the principle of subsidiarity must always prevail, which means that decisions and actions must be taken by the most local forum possible. So still there's not strong powers to work on education. So because the EU lacked a clear remit to develop action on higher education, it used soft power. And what that means is that it worked through a separate organization around the Bologna process, which was an alliance of the ministers of education to align education systems across Europe. And it worked through the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a membership organization of the 40 odd most rich countries in the world, not just Europe. It worked with those two organizations to develop stuff on higher education. But even they had no hard powers to issue directives or make governments comply with their recommendations. So instead, all those three organizations, the EU, the Bologna process, and the OECD, use what's called the open method of coordination, which is that they entice countries and universities to engage in formulating shared objectives. They bring together people in peer learning. Out of that, they devise what's best practice and try and spread that. And then they distill guidelines for policy and action. And then they create measurements of progress against those guidelines for policy and action and league tables, and then name and shame. Name those that are praised and shame those that are not doing what the best practice said they should be doing. So this is a very kind of, it's almost based on emotion. And it's a process of trying to encourage people, countries to come and universities to come together around a shared set of objectives. And this open method of coordination was actually codified. It was set down in the Lisbon strategy. So what we're saying is that research and education are quite different within the EU. Next one. Yeah, so when the EU tried to set up what it calls the Europe of Knowledge, in Lisbon in 2000, there was this strategy to create a Europe of Knowledge, which would be the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustaining economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion and respect for the environment. But it was very clear that by 2010, that had not happened. So then they doubled down and tried to make it happen again by agreeing a strategy called Europe 2020. and added to it the global competitiveness, smart, sustainable, inclusive growth. So that strategy, whether it's the Lisbon strategy or Europe 2020, is based on an imagined world order, where the idea is that there's a global knowledge economy, which is going to happen. It's inexorable and it's fast approaching. It's like the language used in the documents, it's like a train going to hit us unless we actually prepare and get our competitiveness in order. The idea is to coordinate across Europe to make Europe into a world region that becomes the dominant model for forming other world regions. And that world region is marked by competitiveness and mobility. And at one point, there was the idea of Europe's fifth freedom of free circulation of researchers, knowledges, and technology. And that Europe's competitive advantage would be economic dynamism plus social cohesion. But the social dimension disappeared from the documents. But central to the Europe of knowledge were universities, because they produce the raw materials for this global knowledge economy, the research that could be translated into innovative projects and the education to produce highly skilled labor. So that's why they then formed two areas, the European research area and the European higher education area. And as I've said, the two areas of research and education, the EU had very different powers to act on them, but they were both infused with the same assumptions about gearing up for a global knowledge economy, and they were both aligned with an instrumental vision of knowledge being used for industrial innovation and competitiveness. So if we go to the next one, it's interesting actually if you look at the logos of the two. The research area is an image from space of an open space. It calls itself an open space. Whereas the Bologna process, well, the European education area can't stand on its own. It has to link itself to the Bologna process. And both of those are the logos constructed of separate entities that are somehow meant to be brought into relation to each other. Or with the European higher education area, I think the guy on the top right corner seems to be falling off the jigsaw. So totally different kind of ways of imagining Europe. So the European research area had a vastly expanded framework of funding. It focused on priority areas of the knowledge economy, which were health, bioeconomy, ICT, energy, and so on. And in Europe 2020, there was added the digital agenda and decarbonising the economy. And then alongside that was the PhD training program for PhDs and early career researchers, giving mobility across countries, disciplines, and sectors. So that mobility had three meanings: movement across countries, across disciplines, and across sectors. On the other hand, the European higher education area only had, at the bottom, I've got the power of the Erasmus program, and developed that to include the Erasmus Mundus program, where a consortium of European universities could create flagship master's programs, and students could work across 3 universities with the idea of attracting high quality students from across the world. We'll come back to that later, because I think this way of creating alliances and collaboration across universities in some kind of space called Europe was an interesting development that's being used now. But that's really the only power that Europe had on its own. It worked through the Bologna process to make educational systems more comparable, compatible, and coherent. And it worked through the OECD, because the idea was that the EU has supported the conversion process of sectors such as steel or agriculture, and it now faces the imperative to modernize its knowledge industry, and in particular its industries. Universities become part of its knowledge industry. And to do that, the EU worked through the OECD's Programme for Institutional Management on Higher Education. So it's a very bitty process with collaboration between various organisations with different backgrounds, different memberships, and different spaces. Yeah? Over to you. No, you're muted, Andrew.
That was bound to happen. I think someone gets out of the way early in the day. So we were talking about imaginaries previously, the global imaginary. We're seeing how that is one way of creating it is through these two approaches in research and higher education. And the question is, how does Europe see itself? Through what aspects of its imaginary? So one way we were thinking through this is to use the concept of force fields or lines of force. So this is coming from Kurt Lewin in the 1940s writing. And he was looking at originally what either helped or hindered the achievement of a goal in some social setting. Now, he was coming from social psychology. This was quickly ported over to organizational theory and used in those kinds of areas. But it can be used less evaluatively. So the original intention was looking at the different forces that existed in this field and what can help you to get something done. But if we step back from looking at it in that evaluative way, we can use that to see that there are different lines of force within these imaginaries that we're discussing. So we're talking about powers. These can either be hard or soft. So the lines of force can be legal, they can be economic, they can be organizational in terms of how you structure things. They can also, though, be disciplinary in terms of where the emphasis falls in what the kind of things are that you decide to focus on as being important in your European research area or in your European higher education area. But also as well within that, we're not just talking about the European imaginary constructed by Europe. There's the question as well of pre-existing imaginaries that may emphasize the national more than they do international or global cooperation. And one of the points as well that we've touched on so far is the notion of there being the social or the societal as it exists in different policies. That can be a line of force as well. So if this another interesting point about this was that how it has been used and was used was to conceptualize organizations as being dynamic, as changing over time with human agency being involved in that. So the benefit there obviously being that it moves us beyond a static org chart vision of how we organize science or how we organize higher education. But one of the points about lines of force that Lewin didn't really get into was that these lines of force don't all flow smoothly. So when these lines of force are coming up against other lines of force, when one imaginary of Europe is coming up against another imaginary, there can be resistance, there can be friction. And friction in that sense coming from Tsing, who will appear later again, friction as awkward, unequal, unstable, but creative qualities of interconnection across difference. So friction isn't necessarily a bad thing that has to be gotten rid of. That's one of the major points that Tsing is making there. So the same thing for when these different imaginaries with different force fields interact with one another. But these aren't disembodied entities. These aren't organizations that are out there somehow without any human involvement. They're being used by people. So the question is, who can use what lines of force and to what end are they using these lines of force? So to harken back to the point from earlier on, governments can use the international as an instrument for the pursuit of national interest by other means. That's one of Susan Strange's points from back in the 90s when looking at the global. Manfred Steger is making the same point as well. When the global is being constructed, this global imaginary, it has national roots. So whose national roots are they? Could be one question as well to ask there. So how are these different lines of force used by different actors? Are they emphasizing particular visions of Europe? So with an emphasis on the legal and the economic. What kind of Europe is that setting up versus an imaginary of Europe that focuses on the societal, or that at least gives emphasis to the societal? How does this relate then to the nation state? Is that imaginary of Europe attempting to undermine it? Is it attempting to bypass it? Or is it regarding the nation state and the national as an integral part of that imaginary that it's creating? So probably the best way to make sense of this is with a little trip over to Ireland. We're not allowed to get on planes, but I'll bring you with me. The point about Ireland that is useful to remember is that it is peripheral. It's an island, off a peninsula, off a continent. But the point there is that being peripheral doesn't mean that those countries that are on a geographical periphery are not simply reacting to what's going on in some kind of center. That's often how it can be conceptualized, but it often doesn't help us. If we consider the lines of force metaphor that we're using, lines of force from new imaginaries can come up against those of pre-existing competing imaginaries of the international. And that's what I'm going to try show to you now, that when this global imaginary of Europe was being created through the ERA and through the European higher education area, that was a new imaginary of Europe that was being brought in to Ireland. But there was pre-existing imaginaries already in existence. There was a pre-existing imaginary in Ireland of what the international was. And that imaginary developed in the 1960s. And that started specifically with a focus on education and higher education when the OECD, not named that at the time, but came into Ireland for one of the first national reviews of an education system that they ever did. And the OECD's review was looking at the Irish education system and suggesting ways that the Irish education system could and should be changed. That was part of a wider shift away from the previous economic model that Ireland had, which was import substitution industrialization. Basically, we can produce everything at home, so we don't need to trade with anyone else. That didn't work out so well for 3 decades after independence. So there was a pivot in policy towards foreign direct investment. With that pivot, the international that was being created, the notion of who Ireland was going to trade with and how Ireland was going to be one nation interacting with other nations was very much through the lens of economic investment, and specifically by US companies. So the international for Ireland was basically a small island in the North Atlantic between the United Kingdom on one side and the United States on the other. Ireland hadn't been a part of the Marshall Plan, it hadn't gotten funding in that way. So this is the first kind of conceptualization of Ireland as an actor on a global stage. So when Europe comes in and Ireland becomes a member of Europe at the same time as the United Kingdom, there's not this full kind of engagement that you see maybe from continental European countries. There's certainly not the transactional approach from the United Kingdom side that you would often see. What have you done for me lately? There isn't that kind of approach to what Europe is. But there's nevertheless a notion that being a part of Europe is useful. So what Europe brings is added to the existing mix of how things are done. So looking at the concept of the imaginary there, and within the force field, the national is incredibly strong. So the national comes up and is in friction with this notion of the global, of the transnational, of the European. One way of showing that is even through the through the example of how descriptive statistics are used. So in international comparisons, and you'll often see this in European reports that involve some kinds of Irish input in their co-creation. You sometimes see it in OECD reports as well. When comparisons are made according to funding and what kind of funding countries are giving to their higher education systems or to research, they'll often use GDP as their example. So what percentage of GDP is this country putting into their higher education system? The Irish government quite likes being able to say, no, we won't use GDP, we'll use GNP. And the reason for that is the difference between gross domestic product means the money passing through your economy from wherever the company is based. That's just money passing through your economy, whereas GNP is money effectively made within your economy. The problem is for Ireland, because of so many countries being headquartered in Ireland for tax purposes, that can make our GDP look hugely inflated. So if we're using GDP figures, Ireland doesn't look so great. If you use GNP, Ireland looks much better. That means already in this notion where we can all use the same statistics and compare ourselves across Europe, Ireland is very happy to resist that almost immediately and say, no, we're not going to use GDP that everyone else is using. We're going to use GNP. International advice is not immune from criticism. It's not accepted as a given. Another just quick example I'll give is the OECD. How they generally do policy is they will involve people from the national funding agencies, from the government, so that as policy recommendations are being formulated in the report, that is in a palatable form. It is acceptable already. I was at a launch of an OECD report in Dublin where the Minister for Education was handed the list of recommendations that came from the OECD, and he saw the very first line, which was to have one centralized pot of research funding. And this was recommended by the OECD, and he said, no, well, we're not doing that anyway. The very first recommendation at the launch of these OECD recommendations. So this just shows that happiness to resist that. The other point about this is that the European imaginary is constructed to emphasize certain lines of force over others. So this is something we were saying throughout. When this European imaginary enters into Ireland, it encounters friction and it encounters other existing force fields. One way you can see this is through the Bologna process. If you look at the years of the implementation of the Bologna process, one of the aspects of this is the European dimension. And the European dimension in the Bologna process is given a lot of attention in many countries. In Ireland, after the first year or two, the European dimension disappears and isn't mentioned anymore. That's quite a problematic thing in some ways, if you're thinking that Bologna is to create a European vision of what higher education and education is to be, this European imaginary. But when that came into Ireland, it's ignored. So what I'm saying is, in some ways, Ireland's imaginary is banal. So borrowing from Billig's notion of the European, banal nationalism. These pictures to the right that you can see, that's basically what Europe represents in Ireland. It's the odd flag you can see on something where there were structural funds that came into the country, as in Ross Lear report. It's the little flag on your car, and it's at the bottom of government websites. And that is what Europe and the European Union very often seems to represent in Ireland, this kind of banal European imaginary, this banal Europeanism. So, do we want to take a little break, Sue?
It will have to be a little one because we're running well over time.
We are running well over time,
yeah.
Yes. Are there any questions in the chat?
Yeah, there's lots of questions in the chat. CERN had one to start off with, really focusing on the idea that Europe is a construction, and it's, as we pointed out, it's being fabricated all the time. So it's an imaginary, but it's also then being translated into institutional forms with powers and budgets and strategies. Are there any other questions there, Matti, that we should pick up at this point?
Can I just add to that, Sue?
Yeah.
Just very briefly, because yes, thanks a lot. That was one side of my question, how Europe or Europeness is being constantly constructed through different policies. So it's a very plastic, concept, but also because you also use it, our approach in this group and the projects focus on Europe. If there's an underlying understanding of some values or a meaning, perhaps maybe an ideal of Europe that we are working towards, I think that's a little bit implicit in our discussion, and maybe that would be interesting to bring out throughout the conference in the discussions. What our understanding of Europe, which is a more normative perhaps dimension, is.
And I think we'll get to that in the second half of this talk a bit as we move into the more recent ideas. Because the other thing that I think has been picked up in the chat is the way that the social dimension and the European dimension keep disappearing from ideas of Europe. And Andrew's just said that with Ireland, the European dimension disappeared. But more recently, they've come back again. So which of the various versions of a European imaginary become dominant at different points changes over time. And whether we want to position ourselves within that is then we being the project is another question. Yeah. Are there any other thoughts or questions? Susanna's raised some interesting points, and also some interesting points about Russia moving in and out of the story. Does anyone else want to add any questions at this point? There's a really interesting chat happening alongside talking. No, shall we move on to the next slide then? Because the point now, if I can get rid of my chat out of the screen, there we go. The point now is to contrast the way that Ireland has engaged with these various imaginaries of Europe with the way that that has happened in Denmark. And I've done this as an ethnographic study, locating who was doing what in the various organizations. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were senior civil servants from Denmark playing important roles in formulating the EDC's Lisbon strategy, in chairing the Bologna follow-up group and the committee that developed the framework of qualifications for the Bologna process. Another Dane chaired the European organization to coordinate quality assurance in higher education. Another one was chairing the OECD's Education Committee, and another one was then also on the OECD's Centre for Educational Research and Innovation, which came forward with many of the policy recommendations. In addition to that, Danish politicians and rectors and some academics were also very active in these forums, especially in the OECD. And Denmark focused a lot of its activity in the late 90s in the OECD. So this is Denmark seconding people or sending people to be really active in formulating the ideas, the best practices, the policy recommendations that were coming out of this cluster of organizations. So importantly, the document that was produced in 1997 called Redefining Tertiary Education, I think is really one of the key documents here. And out of that and subsequent documents, there was an OECD narrative that Humboldtian or collegial, they call them various things, critical thinking universities are part of the past. And they're the problem of the current. And the solution is to reform universities to make them managerial and market orientated and capable of driving member states' competitiveness in a fast approaching future global knowledge economy. So they were the Danes were part of building up that narrative, that imaginary of Europe. But then, in contrast to the way that the minister in Ireland responded to the OECD review of Irish higher education, the Danes invited the OECD to do a review of higher education midway through the process of passing the first big university law that was to reform the universities. So they'd used the OECD to generate a lot of these ideas for reforming the universities. They'd got the law going through Parliament, and they invite the OECD in to review the universities to prepare the next set of reforms that they wanted to bring in, which was university mergers. And as in all of these OECD review panels, there's a very interactive process between the ministry and the OECD review panels. But even so, when the OECD finally produced its results, it only recommended closer cooperation between the universities. And the minister then presented an action plan that claimed that it was coming out of the OECD recommendations, but actually it changed them to say that what they recommended was halving the number of universities. And that created uproar with some of the people on the OECD panel. And in meetings of the OECD, there was often reference to what was called the Danish disease, which was Denmark adopted the most radical cocktail of the EU, OECD, and Bologna process reform agendas in its national university reforms. So you can see an enormous contrast between Ireland and Denmark. If we move to the next slide. Yeah. So then that takes us to our third big concept in this talk, which is the idea of activists. You know, who are the people making these policies? And we've got a number of concepts here for thinking about the kind of activism that was involved in the Europe-Denmark interface. So there are a number of international agencies, which we've already listed, but including also the World Bank and UNESCO, and the soft parts of the EU that operate through networks and through the open method of coordination. And they create these networks from different countries and from government, universities, unions, think tanks, business, consultancies, and NGOs. It's what Stavros Moutsias, one of my colleagues, calls governance without politics, because these networks are created, but there's no involvement of citizens in dialogue or critique of the political arguments. I call that kind of network, following Haas, an epistemic community. These are experts who've been recruited to develop the soft power mechanisms that I've listed, you know, defining the emerging trends, the best practice, the policy guidance, and then creating the statistical indicators and the scoreboards and the league tables to construct peer reviews. But following Tampio, they act like a kind of tumbling cloud. People are recruited into it. They meet in different forums, both say within the OECD, but they'll also meet in UNESCO, and maybe some of them would be in the World Bank and others in the Bologna process. So there's a whole series of meetings that the same rough bunch of people are meeting each other in. New people are being recruited all the time, but others are being sloughed off if they don't fit into the prevailing way the conversation is going. And they form a network with no public identity, has no name, has no website, has no membership or blog, and no identified leader or coordinator. But they produce a narrative, a roughly shared vision of the future, which defines the problem of the present and what needs to be done. And as Mahon and McBride say, they sing from the same hymn book, but they're not necessarily all singing the same hymn, the same song. So they've got a roughly shared vision of the future. And they're all operating across at least two interfaces. They're both positioned within this international epistemic community, and they're positioned in some kind of national policy making position. They're not layered, they're acting in two different spaces at the same time. And they move ideas back and forth across those spaces. They help develop the agency's narrative of what the problem is and what needs to be done. And then, at least from the Danish point of view, they refer to the OECD's vision or policy prescriptions as if they come from an independent and objective authority that they've had nothing to do with. As they disavow that side of their activities and then feed them into national policy making. So there's this particular way they work across interfaces. And I call these kind of, some of these people who are working across these interfaces, activists, because in addition to being members of an epistemic community, they hold positions in government or in university leadership through which they can turn this roughly shared vision into action. They enact the university reforms and the world that's envisaged through them. Shall we move on? But there's another kind of activist, which are the kind of people who set up the European Research Council. And this is an interesting story on its own. because when the Lisbon strategy was formed, scientists got very excited about it because an opportunity for decisions about knowledge, about research funding to be science-driven, not policy-driven, with funding based on scientific quality. And they got very upset by the way that the funding was going policy-driven. So they looked for a way to try and make it science-driven. And they engaged in disciplinary activism. They coordinated with the heads of well-funded research centres and large disciplinary associations across Europe. And the starting point for this was this logo at the top, the Federation of European Biochemical Societies. And they worked through disciplinary associations and eventually got the humanities and the social sciences also involved. So they brought all the disciplines of Europe together. They then formed a formal organisation called the Initiative for Sciences in Europe, ISE, which had a name, a remit, a chair, the membership of these scientific associations. And they interacted with decision makers. So the chair that they appointed of the ISE himself became the Portuguese Minister of Science. And through a series of strategic conferences and lobbying activities, they brought on board the EU's Commissioner for Science, the other ministers for science, the research councils, the large foundations, and eventually the European Commission as well. And they had success. In 2016, the European Research Council was established with a small budget to start with, which doubled within a few years. It's still a very small percentage of the total H2020 budget. And the remit of the ERC is for early and senior researchers to apply for funding on topics of their own choosing, covering all fields of knowledge, and decisions are based on scientific quality. So this was an amazing mobilization of academics across Europe to change European policy. But the longer aim of this ERC was through the European Research Council, through this bottom-up knowledge production, they would then begin to influence the agenda of the Horizon 2020 program, or the FP programs. And that collapsed. The ERC very much goes on its own little track, and the Horizon 2020 now, or Horizon Europe, goes on its separate track. Only the biomedical community has managed to keep going, setting up policy communities and a scientific panel for health, which they say advises the EC on scientific input into the social challenges for health, demography and well-being in the H2020 plan. So this idea of mobilizing academics to have a science-led policy of research in Europe has not come about. And that kind of model of activism could fit with what Deleuze and Guattari calls the image of a tree, where there's a root, there's a clear aim to set up the ERC, there's a trunk, there's a central organization, and there's branches. All the disciplinary associations are drawn into the trunk strategy. But there's a missing image in that idea of the tree, in that how does the ISE tree successfully connect with European decision-making peoples and powers? In other words, how does the tree connect with the cloud? Now, Deleuze says we're tired of trees because they're hierarchical, organized centers, and they want to shake that image loose and challenge the hegemony of that signifier. And that's in fact what begins to happen soon afterwards, if we move to the next slide. Yeah. Because now, this is what, I haven't done ethnographic work on this to work out who was doing all these things, but you can see the finger traces of a mobilization of people that have begun to unsettle the global knowledge economy and bring back into the agenda the social dimension and the European dimension of Europe. So the Midway report on the Lisbon strategy said it's not going to work anyway. the financial crisis in 2008 showed up the flaws in economic thinking and showed up the inequalities and the political extremism that was possible as a result of that. And then in 2015, the Ministers of Education meeting for the Bologna process at Yerevan made this important shift, saying that the European higher education area faces social challenges and needs a new vision to support universities to promote intercultural understanding, critical thinking, political and religious tolerance, gender equality, and democratic and civic values in order to strengthen European and global citizenship and lay the foundations for inclusive societies. In other words, this is no longer wedding the EHEA to the global knowledge economy agenda. And then you see in 2017, September, President Macron makes a speech at the Sorbonne, going back to the original place where the first meeting was that set up the Bologna process. Now he goes back to the Sorbonne. And in a long, long speech, he talks about needing to create a route for rebuilding a sovereign, united, democratic Europe to defend our values and interests, human rights, freedom, market economy, and social justice in the context of globalization. There's a lot in that speech about security and about the economy, but there's also an image of Europe as made up of multiple cultures and multiple languages. This is, of course, post-Brexit, when the English influencers walked away. So he wants a Europe of multiple cultures and multiple languages that aren't dissolved together. But on the same time, Europe is bound together by culture, which he exemplifies as the Mona Lisa, and knowledge, which he thinks of as education, and in particular universities. So in page 13 of this long speech, there's one little paragraph in which he talks about creating European universities. He wants 20 of them by 2024, and they would be where all students study abroad and take classes in 2 languages. So this is his image of understanding multiple cultures and languages. That's followed in November 17 by the Gothenburg Social Summit on strengthening European identity through education and culture. And it's very much picking up the language from Macron's speech. Europe is unity in diversity. A market economy plus social principles plus the social dimension of Europe. Again, it says the EU has no competence to harmonize education, but a new language, they want upward convergence through cooperation with member states. In other words, member states, we're telling you what to do. And the language changes. There's a lot of instructions to member states about what to do. And for the first time, the ministers of education and the ministers of finance agree that education and skills should be a strategic priority of the EU. So the whole education agenda has shifted in its importance within the European Union. So they then say that there should be a European education area, not just higher education area, which spans the whole of education from preschool to lifelong learning and making it unhampered by borders. Increasing the budget and scope of the Erasmus Plus and making sure that the opportunities reach disadvantaged students, making 2 foreign languages compulsory in schools and university, and tucked on the end, creating European universities. So what are these European universities? Go to the next slide. So in September 30th, 2017, 2 new strategies are produced on exactly the same day, a European research strategy and a European education area strategy. The European research one is very much the same as before. And it's still focused on research and innovation, mobile workers for industry, not covering research for the wider social and European agendas that were seen in the Macron speech and in the Gothenburg meeting. But they're in the other strategy, the European education area strategy. This sets up targets for improving education from preschool to lifelong learning And so universities are just one bit of it, but they're defined as central to the knowledge square. So they're not the knowledge economy, the knowledge square: education, research, innovation, and service to society. It's a new definition. And the aim is to produce seamless transnational cooperation between institutions, co-creating knowledge across borders, disciplines, and cultures for a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable society. And to do that through mobility between national systems, through creating joint curricula across universities and producing what they call a European student card, to reduce inequalities of access and increase their mobility, social mobility, to improve gender balance in education, in academic careers and in leadership, and to use higher education as an instrument in the EU's soft power to spread European values and positive images in the world. And one of the ways of doing that was to create these European universities using funding from Erasmus Plus and some of the research funding. And they are to be alliances of collaborating universities to do all that above list of activities. And also the EU then, or the EC then says, it's got a number of administrative things or legal things to work out about the status of the European universities. Is it possible to produce a European degree? What will be the legal statute for these alliances of collaborating universities? If they're moving away from being just located in nation states towards some kind of space called Europe, what's the legal basis for that? And how do we create a quality assurance system, which again is a national basis one at the moment, that creates public trust for recognition of learning across borders? So here, the main points are that there's a strong focus on the social dimension and the European dimension. And it involves universities in creating these agendas. It kind of bypasses states. 40 of these universities, European universities, have already been approved. And they've been set the task of working out themselves how to govern and organize themselves, and how to create collaborative, student-centered, borderless education and mobility and multilingualism. So in other words, the EU doesn't know how to do this. It's not asking the member states to work out how to do this. It's created these 40 European universities, and they're like trains that are laying the tracks in front of them as they go forward. They're having to work out how to organize themselves across borders and how to create a collaborative joint teaching of students across different countries with mobility and multilingualism. So this means that there are new lines of force. The social dimension, the European dimension have come to the fore, and there's new opportunities for our leaders and ourselves and students to be shaping that new image of Europe. We move to the next one. So what kind of activism do we need to create European universities? Should it be a tree or a cloud? Well, let's start off by updating the scientific knowledge about trees, because I think Deleuze and Guattari had a very old image of trees. And if you look in the text box on the left-hand side, they thought of trees as solitary individuals in competition. But now science is telling us that no, their roots are interwoven by this word I can't say, fungi, that connect 90% of plants on the land. And they work through mutualism. The tree provides sugar and the fungus has enzymes that the tree doesn't have to generate nitrogen and phosphorus, which the tree needs to survive. And then the fungi produce a network of threads that connect the trees to each other, through which the trees communicate with each other. They transfer water and sugar and information about pests coming or other dangers. And older trees support younger trees growing up in their shade. And when older trees die, they shift their resources two other trees. So there's a whole network of resources being shared and information being shared. I'm really inspired by Anna Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, where she talks about new ways of thinking about the economy. And I use that to reimagine universities and their role in the world. So this is a kind of the mushroom comes up again here. The way that that thinking then moves is to think that universities are not being reduced to economic drivers of national competitiveness in a world imagined as a global knowledge economy. We can begin thinking of universities as part of a wood-wide web. But to do that, then, the kind of activism that's needed is how to gather up the energy from the fungus, that's the academics and the students, without destroying our intricate networks and diverse social, political, environmental, and economic activities. But probably there needs to be some trunk-like organization, especially to identify the room for maneuver, because not all of us are in touch with the European movements in these different lines of force that are going on. So we need people to identify openings in the lines of force. And then when we've developed ideas, we need to have some way of connecting to the activists in the cloud who can operate in the interface between institutions and in national and European policy making. Over to Andrew.
And yeah, just very quickly, because it's 2 minutes past 10, just some quick conclusions from the approach that we took, which is just to say, having imaginaries, you know, it's useful as a conceptual approach because they bring some coherence to an area that, as we're saying, can collapse under the weight of simple description. If you tried to cover everything that had been done in the last 20 years, it's useful to have some kind of way of giving yourself a lateral cut across that. Lines of force are useful for considering multiple coexisting or competing factors. When you take something like this European imaginary into Denmark or into Ireland, contextualizing it, it allows you to show that in that imaginary, there are multiple lines of force, and some can have been ignored or de-emphasized. Some can be neutralized when they come into a certain setting, such as the European line of force in the European imaginary being neutralized when it enters into Ireland. We can also identify that certain lines of force, such as the societal, were de-emphasized at the European level when constructing this European imaginary of what higher education and research should be. Similar to what we were saying about, you know, policy is never just policy. Activists don't just participate in these epistemic communities. They're creating imaginaries and moving these imaginaries across interfaces. And it's important to note they're not just moving them across levels. That would lead us to think that moving from one level to another, that it's discrete in some way. It's passing through an interface, passing through a membrane. But they also have these, yes, institutional positions and are aware of the lines of force and opportunities for enacting their imaginaries. So this is the point about being able to disavow. So participating from a national perspective, being able to participate in something like the OECD, passing through that interface, getting involved in the co-creation of those policies at the European or the OECD level, and then coming back into the national setting allows for that kind of disavowal. Do you want to say something there on the new European imaginary, Sue?
Yeah, well, that comes back to my wood-wide web, really, because perhaps there is an opening for using the openings in the lines of force in Europe at the moment create a possible space for us, through our own ideas of what the university should be, to activate new dimensions. But to do that, those ideas need to be gathered up in some way to use the academic and the students' ideas and their energies. And what kind of activism is needed to achieve that? And what I'm suggesting, and this is thinking that, you know, is just going on, some combination of the tree, the wood, and the cloud. and that's really an open space for discussion.